Chapter 49. Containing the story of the bagman's uncle. My uncle, gentleman, said the bagman, was one of the merriest, pleasantest, cleverest fellows that ever lived. I wish you had known him, gentlemen. On second thoughts, gentlemen, I don't wish you had known him, for if you had, you would have been all, by this time, in the ordinary course of nature, if not dead, at all events so near it, as to have taken to stopping at home and giving up company, which would have deprived me of the inestimable pleasure of addressing you at this moment. Gentlemen, I wish your fathers and mothers had known my uncle. They would have been amazingly fond of him, especially your respectable mothers. I know they would. If any two of his numerous virtues predominated over the many that adorned his character, I should say they were his mixed punch and his after-supper song. Excuse my dwelling on these melancholy recollections of departed worth. You won't see a man like my uncle every day in the week. I have always considered it a great point in my uncle's character, gentlemen, that he was the intimate friend and companion of Tom Smart, of the great house of Bilson and Slum, Cateaton Street, City. My uncle collected for Tiggin and Whelps, but for a long time he went pretty near the same journey as Tom. And the very first night they met, my uncle took a fancy for Tom, and Tom took a fancy for my uncle. They made a bet of a new hat before they had known each other half an hour, who should brew the best quart of punch and drink it the quickest. My uncle was judged to have won the making, but Tom Smart beat him in the drinking by about half a saltspoonful. They took another quart apiece to drink each other's health in, and were staunch friends ever afterwards. There's a destiny in these things, gentlemen, we can't help it. In personal appearance, my uncle was a trifle shorter than the middle size. He was a thought stouter, too, than the ordinary run of people, and perhaps his face might be a shade redder. He had the jolliest face you ever saw, gentlemen, something like Punch with a handsome nose and chin. His eyes were always twinkling and sparkling with good humor. And smile not one of your unmeaning wooden grins, but a real, merry, hearty, good-tempered smile was perpetually on his countenance. He was pitched out of his gig once, and knocked, head first, against a milestone. There he lay, stunned, and so cut about the face with some gravel which had been heaped up alongside it, that, to use my uncle's own strong expression, if his mother could have revisited the earth, she wouldn't have known him. Indeed, when I come to think of the matter, gentlemen, I feel pretty sure she wouldn't, for she died when my uncle was 2 years and 7 months old, and I think it's very likely that, even without the gravel, his top boots would have puzzled the good lady not a little, to say nothing of his jolly red face. However, there he lay, and I have heard my uncle say, many a time, that the man said who picked him up that he was smiling as merrily as if he had tumbled out for a treat, and that after they had bled him, the first faint glimmerings of returning animation were his jumping up in bed, bursting out into a loud laugh, kissing the young woman who held the basin, and demanding a mutton chop and a pickled walnut. He was very fond of pickled walnuts, gentlemen. He said he always found that, taken without vinegar, they relished the beer. My uncle's great journey was in the fall of the leaf, at which time he collected debts and took orders in the north, going from London to Edinburgh, from Edinburgh to Glasgow, from Glasgow back to Edinburgh, and thence to London by the smack. You are to understand that his second visit to Edinburgh was for his own pleasure. He used to go back for a week, just to look up his old friends, and what with breakfasting with this one, lunching with that, dining with the third, and supping with another, a pretty tight week he used to make of it. I don't know whether any of you, gentlemen, ever partook of a real substantial hospitable Scotch breakfast, and then went out to a slight lunch of a bushel of oysters, a dozen or so of bottled ale, and a noggin or two of whiskey to close up with. If you ever did, you will agree with me that it requires a pretty strong head to go out to dinner and supper afterwards. But bless your hearts and eyebrows, all this sort of thing was nothing to my uncle. He was so well seasoned that it was mere child's play. Have heard him say that he could see the Dundee people out any day and walk home afterwards without staggering. And yet the Dundee people have as strong heads and as strong punch, gentlemen, as you are likely to meet with between the poles. I have heard of a Glasgow man and a Dundee man drinking against each other for 15 hours at a sitting. They were both suffocated, as nearly as could be ascertained at the same moment, but with this trifling exception, gentlemen, they were not a bit the worse for it. One night, within 24 hours of the time when he had settled to take shipping for London, my uncle supped at the house of a very old friend of his, a Bailey Mac something and 4 syllables after it, who lived in the old town of Edinburgh. There were the Bailey's wife, and the Bailey's 3 daughters, and the Bailey's grown-up son, and 3 or 4 stout, bushy-eyebrowed, canny, old Scotch fellows that the Bailey had got together to do honor to my uncle and help to make merry. It was a glorious supper. There was kippered salmon and finnan haddocks and a lamb's head, and a haggisa celebrated Scotch dish, gentlemen, which my uncle used to say always looked to him, when it came to table, very much like a Cupid's stomach and a great many other things besides, that I forget the names of but very good things notwithstanding. The lasses were pretty and agreeable. The Bailey's wife was one of the best creatures that ever lived, and my uncle was in thoroughly good cue. The consequence of which was that the young ladies tittered and giggled, and the old lady laughed out loud, and the Bailey and the other old fellows roared till they were red in the face, the whole mortal time. I don't quite recollect how many tumblers of whiskey toddy each man drank after supper. But this I know, that about 1 o'clock in the morning, the Bailey's grown-up son became insensible while attempting the first verse of Willie Brood a Peck o' Mout. And he having been, for half an hour before, the only other man visible above the mahogany, it occurred to my uncle that it was almost time to think about going, especially as drinking had set in at 7 o'clock, in order that he might get home at a decent hour. But thinking it might not be quite polite to go just then, my uncle voted himself into the chair, mixed another glass, rose to propose his own health, addressed himself in a neat and complimentary speech, and drank the toast with great enthusiasm. Still nobody woke, so my uncle took a little drop more neat this time, to prevent the toddy from disagreeing with him, and laying violent hands on his hat, sallied forth into the street. It was a wild, gusty night when my uncle closed the Bailey's door, and settling his hat firmly on his head to prevent the wind from taking it, thrust his hands into his pockets, and looking upward, took a short survey of the state of the weather. The clouds were drifting over the moon at their giddiest speed, at one time wholly obscuring her, at another suffering her to burst forth in full splendor and shed her light on all the objects around, anon driving over her again with increased velocity and shrouding everything in darkness. "Really, this won't do," said my uncle, addressing himself to the weather as if he felt himself personally offended. "This is not at all the kind of thing for my voyage." "It will not do at any price," said my uncle very impressively. Having repeated this several times, he recovered his balance with some difficulty, for he was rather giddy with looking up into the sky, so Longend walked merrily on. The Bailey's house was in the Canongate, and my uncle was going to the other end of Leith Walk, rather better than a mile's journey. On either side of him, there shot up against the dark sky, tall, gaunt, straggling houses, with time-stained fronts and windows that seemed to have shared the lot of eyes in mortals, and to have grown dim and sunken with age. 6, 7, 8-story high were the houses, story piled upon story, as children build with cards throwing their dark shadows over the roughly paved road and making the dark night darker. A few oil lamps were scattered at long distances, but they only served to mark the dirty entrance to some narrow close, or to show where a common stair communicated, by steep and intricate windings, with the various flats above. Glancing at all these things with the air of a man who had seen them too often before to think them worthy of much notice now, my uncle walked up the middle of the street, with a thumb in each waistcoat pocket, indulging from time to time in various snatches of song, chanted forth with such goodwill and spirit, that the quiet honest folk started from their first sleep and lay trembling in bed till the sound died away in the distance, when, satisfying themselves that it was only some drunken ne'er-do-weel finding his way home, they covered themselves up warm and fell asleep again. I am particular in describing how my uncle walked up the middle of the street, with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, gentlemen, because, as he often used to say, and with great reason too, there is nothing at all extraordinary in this story, unless you distinctly understand at the beginning that he was not by any means of a marvelous or romantic turn. "Gentlemen," my uncle walked on with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets, taking the middle of the street to himself, and singing, now a verse of a love song and then a verse of a drinking one, and when he was tired of both, whistling melodiously until he reached the North Bridge, which, at this point, connects the old and new towns of Edinburgh. Here he stopped for a minute to look at the strange, irregular clusters of lights piled one above the other, and twinkling afar off so high that they looked like stars, gleaming from the castle walls on the one side and the Calton Hill on the other, as if they illuminated veritable castles in the air. While the old picturesque town slept heavily on, in gloom and darkness below. Its palace and chapel of Holyrood, guarded day and night, as a friend of my uncle's used to say, by old Arthur's seat, towering, surly and dark, like some gruff genius, over the ancient city he has watched so long. I say, gentlemen, my uncle stopped here for a minute to look about him, and then, paying a compliment to the weather, which had a little cleared up, though the moon was sinking, walked on again, as royally as before, keeping the middle of the road with great dignity, and looking as if he would very much like to meet with somebody who would dispute possession of it with him. There was nobody at all disposed to contest the point, as it happened, and so on he went, with his thumbs in his waistcoat pockets like a lamb. When my uncle reached the end of Leith Walk, he had to cross a pretty large piece of waste ground, which separated him from a short street, which he had to turn down to go direct to his lodging. Now, in this piece of waste ground, there was, at that time, an enclosure belonging to some wheelwright who contracted with the post office for the purchase of old, worn-out mail coaches. And my uncle, being very fond of coaches, old, young, or middle-aged, all at once took it into his head to step out of his road for no other purpose than to peep between the palings at these mails about, a dozen of which he remembered to have seen, crowded together in a very forlorn and dismantled state, inside. My uncle was a very enthusiastic, emphatic sort of person, gentleman. So, finding that he could not obtain a good peep between the palings, he got over them, and sitting himself quietly down on an old axle-tree, began to contemplate the mail coaches with a deal of gravity. There might be a dozen of them, or there might be more. My uncle was never quite certain on this point, and being a man of very scrupulous veracity about numbers, didn't like to say, but there they stood, all huddled together in the most desolate condition imaginable. The doors had been torn from their hinges and removed, the linings had been stripped off, only a shred hanging here and there by a rusty nail. The lamps were gone, the poles had long since vanished, the ironwork was rusty, the paint was worn away. The wind whistled through the chinks in the bare woodwork, and the rain, which had collected on the roofs, fell drop by drop into the insides with a hollow and melancholy sound. They were the decaying skeletons of departed males, and in that lonely place, at that time of night, they looked chill and dismal. My uncle rested his head upon his hands and thought of the busy, bustling people who had rattled about years before in the old coaches, and were now as silent and changed. He thought of the numbers of people to whom one of these crazy, moldering vehicles had borne, night after night, for many years, and through all weathers, the anxiously expected intelligence, the eagerly looked-for remittance, the promised assurance of health and safety, the sudden announcement of sickness and death. The merchant, the lover, the wife, the widow, the mother, the schoolboy, the very child who tottered to the door at the postman's knock-how, had they all looked forward to the arrival of the old coach. And where were they all now? Gentlemen, my uncle used to say that he thought all this at the time, but I rather suspect he learned it out of some book afterwards, for he distinctly stated that he fell into a kind of doze, as he sat on the old axle-tree looking at the decayed mail coaches, and that he was suddenly awakened by some deep church bell striking 2. Now, my uncle was never a fast thinker, and if he had thought all these things, I am quite certain it would have taken him till full 2:30 at the very least. I am, therefore, decidedly of opinion, gentlemen, that my uncle fell into a kind of doze, without having thought about anything at all. Be this as it may, a church bell struck 2. My uncle woke, rubbed his eyes, and jumped up in astonishment. In one instant, after the clock struck 2, the whole of this deserted and quiet spot had become a scene of most extraordinary life and animation. The mail coach doors were on their hinges, the lining was replaced, the ironwork was as good as new, the paint was restored, the lamps were alight. Cushions and greatcoats were on every coach box, porters were thrusting parcels into every boot, Guards were stowing away letter bags, hostlers were dashing pails of water against the renovated wheels. Numbers of men were pushing about, fixing poles into every coach. Passengers arrived, portmanteaus were handed up, horses were put to. In short, it was perfectly clear that every mail there was to be off directly. Gentlemen, my uncle opened his eyes so wide at all this, that, to the very last moment of his life, he used to wonder how it fell out that he had ever been able to shut M again. "Now then," said a voice, as my uncle felt a hand on his shoulder, "you're booked for one inside. You'd better get in." "I booked," said my uncle, turning round. "Yes, certainly." My uncle, gentlemen, could say nothing, he was so very much astonished. The queerest thing of all was that although there was such a crowd of persons, and although fresh faces were pouring in, every moment, there was no telling where they came from. They seemed to start up, in some strange manner, from the ground or the air, and disappear in the same way. When a porter had put his luggage in the coach and received his fare, he turned round and was gone. And before my uncle had well begun to wonder what had become of him, half a dozen fresh ones started up, and staggered along under the weight of parcels, which seemed big enough to crush them. The passengers were all dressed so oddly too. Large, broad-skirted laced coats, with great cuffs and no collars, and wigs, gentlemen great formal wigs with a tie behind. My uncle could make nothing of it. "Now, are you going to get in?" said the person who had addressed my uncle before. He was dressed as a male guard, with a wig on his head and most enormous cuffs to his coat, and had a lantern in one hand and a huge blunderbuss in the other, which he was going to stow away in his little arm chest. "Are you going to get in, Jack Martin?" said the guard, holding the lantern to my uncle's face. "Hallo," said my uncle, falling back a step or two. "That's familiar." "It's so on the waybill," said the guard. "Isn't there a Mr. before it?" said my uncle. For he felt, gentlemen, that for a guard he didn't know, to call him Jack Martin, was a liberty which the post office wouldn't have sanctioned if they had known it. "No, there is not," rejoined the guard coolly. "Is the fare paid?" inquired my uncle. "Of course it is," rejoined the guard. "It is it?" said my uncle. "Then here goes." "Which coach?" "This," said the guard, pointing to an old-fashioned Edinburgh and London mail, which had the steps down and the door open. "Stop. Here are the other passengers. Let them get in first." As the guard spoke, there all at once appeared, right in front of my uncle, a young gentleman in a powdered wig and a sky-blue coat trimmed with silver, made very full and broad in the skirts, which were lined with buckram. Tiggin and whelps were in the printed calico and waistcoat piece line, gentlemen, so my uncle knew all the materials at once. He wore knee breeches, and a kind of leggings rolled up over his silk stockings, and shoes with buckles. He had ruffles at his wrists, a three-cornered hat on his head, and a long taper sword by his side. The flaps of his waistcoat came halfway down his thighs, and the ends of his cravat reached to his waist. He stalked gravely to the coach door, pulled off his hat, and held it above his head at arm's length, cocking his little finger in the air at the same time as some affected people do when they take a cup of tea. Then he drew his feet together, and made a low, grave bow, and then put out his left hand. My uncle was just going to step forward, and shake it heartily, when he perceived that these attentions were directed, not towards him, but to a young lady who just then appeared at the foot of the steps, attired in an old-fashioned green velvet dress with a long waist and stomacher. She had no bonnet on her head, gentlemen, which was muffled in a black silk hood, but she looked round for an instant as she prepared to get into the coach, and such a beautiful face as she disclosed, my uncle had never seen, not even in a picture. She got into the coach, holding up her dress with one hand, and as my uncle always said with a round oath, when he told the story, he wouldn't have believed it possible that legs and feet could have been brought to such a state of perfection unless he had seen them with his own eyes. But in this one glimpse of the beautiful face, my uncle saw that the young lady cast an imploring look upon him, and that she appeared terrified and distressed. He noticed, too, that the young fellow in the powdered wig, notwithstanding his show of gallantry, which was all very fine and grand, clasped her tight by the wrist when she got in, and followed himself immediately afterwards. An uncommonly ill-looking fellow, in a close brown wig and a plum-colored suit, wearing a very large sword and boots up to his hips, belonged to the party. And when he sat himself down next to the young lady, who shrank into a corner at his approach, my uncle was confirmed in his original impression that something dark and mysterious was going forward. Or, as he always said himself, that there was a screw loose somewhere. It's quite surprising how quickly he made up his mind to help the lady at any peril, if she needed any help. "Death and lightning!" exclaimed the young gentleman, laying his hand upon his sword as my uncle entered the coach. "Blood and thunder!" roared the other gentleman. With this, he whipped his sword out and made a lunge at my uncle without further ceremony. My uncle had no weapon about him, but with great dexterity he snatched the ill-looking gentleman's three-cornered hat from his head, and, receiving the point of his sword right through the crown, squeezed the sides together and held it tight. "Pink him behind!" cried the ill-looking gentleman to his companion as he struggled to regain his sword. "He had better not," cried my uncle, displaying the heel of one of his shoes in a threatening manner. "I'll kick his brains out if he has any, or fracture his skull if he hasn't." Exerting all his strength, at this moment, my uncle wrenched the ill-looking man's sword from his grasp and flung it clean out of the coach window, upon which the younger gentleman vociferated, "Death and lightning!" again, and laid his hand upon the hilt of his sword in a very fierce manner, but didn't draw it. Perhaps, gentlemen, as my uncle used to say with a smile, perhaps he was afraid of alarming the lady. "Now, gentlemen," said my uncle, taking his seat deliberately, "I don't want to have any death, with or without lightning, in a lady's presence, and we have had quite blood and thundering enough for one journey. So, if you please, we'll sit in our places like quiet insides. Here, guard, pick up that gentleman's carving knife." As quickly as my uncle said the words, the guard appeared at the coach window, with the gentleman's sword in his hand. He held up his lantern, and looked earnestly in my uncle's face as he handed it in, when, by its light, my uncle saw, to his great surprise, that an immense crowd of male coach guards swarmed round the window, every one of whom had his eyes earnestly fixed upon him too. He had never seen such a sea of white faces, red bodies, and earnest eyes, in all his born days. "This is the strangest sort of thing I ever had anything to do with," thought my uncle. "Allow me to return your hat, sir." The ill-looking gentleman received his three-cornered hat in silence, looked at the hole in the middle with an inquiring air, and finally stuck it on the top of his wig with a solemnity, the effect of which was a trifle impaired by his sneezing violently at the moment and jerking it off again. "All right," cried the guard with the lantern, mounting into his little seat behind. Away they went. My uncle peeped out of the coach window as they emerged from the yard, and observed that the other males, with coachmen, guards, horses, and passengers, complete, were driving round and round in circles, at a slow trot of about 5 miles an hour. My uncle burned with indignation, gentlemen. As a commercial man, he felt that the mail-bags were not to be trifled with, and he resolved to memorialize the post office on the subject, the very instant he reached London. At present, however, his thoughts were occupied with the young lady who sat in the farthest corner of the coach, with her face muffled closely in her hood, the gentleman with the sky-blue coat sitting opposite to her, the other man in the plum-colored suit by her side, and both watching her intently. If she so much as rustled the folds of her hood, he could hear the ill-looking man clap his hand upon his sword, and could tell by the other's breathing, it was so dark he couldn't see his face, that he was looking as big as if he were going to devour her at a mouthful. This roused my uncle more and more, and he resolved, come what might, to see the end of it. He had a great admiration for bright eyes, and sweet faces, and pretty legs and feet. In short, he was fond of the whole sex. It runs in our family, gentlemen, so am I. Many were the devices which my uncle practiced, to attract the lady's attention, or at all events, to engage the mysterious gentleman in conversation. They were all in vain. The gentleman wouldn't talk, and the lady didn't dare. He thrust his head out of the coach window at intervals, and bawled out to know why they didn't go faster. But he called till he was hoarse. Nobody paid the least attention to him. He leaned back in the coach, and thought of the beautiful face, and the feet and legs. This answered better. It whiled away the time, and kept him from wondering where he was going, and how it was that he found himself in such an odd situation. Not that this would have worried him much, Anyway, he was a mighty free and easy, roving, devil-may-care sort of person, was my uncle, gentleman. All of a sudden the coach stopped. "Hallo," said my uncle, "what's in the wind now?" "A light here," said the guard, letting down the steps. "Here," cried my uncle. "Here," rejoined the guard. "I'll do nothing of the sort," said my uncle. "Very well, then stop where you are," said the guard. "I will," said my uncle. "Do," said the guard. The passengers had regarded this colloquy with great attention, and finding that my uncle was determined not to alight, the younger man squeezed past him to hand the lady out. At this moment, the ill-looking man was inspecting the hole in the crown of his three-cornered hat. As the young lady brushed past, she dropped one of her gloves into my uncle's hand and softly whispered, with her lips so close to his face that he felt her warm breath on his nose, the single word, "Help." "Gentlemen," my uncle leaped out of the coach at once, with such violence that it rocked on the springs again. "Oh, you've thought better of it, have you?" said the guard, when he saw my uncle standing on the ground. My uncle looked at the guard for a few seconds, in some doubt whether it wouldn't be better to wrench his blunderbuss from him, fire it in the face of the man with the big sword, knock the rest of the company over the head with the stock, snatch up the young lady, and go off in the smoke. On second thoughts, however, he abandoned this plan, as being a shade too melodramatic in the execution, and followed the two mysterious men, who, keeping the lady between them, were now entering an old house in front of which the coach had stopped. They turned into the passage, and my uncle followed. Of all the ruinous and desolate places my uncle had ever beheld, this was the most so. It looked as if it had once been a large house of entertainment, but the roof had fallen in many places, and the stairs were steep, rugged, and broken. There was a huge fireplace in the room into which they walked, and the chimney was blackened with smoke, but no warm blaze lighted it up now. The white feathery dust of burned wood was still strewed over the hearth, but the stove was cold, and all was dark and gloomy. "Well," said my uncle, as he looked about him, "a mail traveling at the rate of 6 miles and a half an hour, and stopping for an indefinite time at such a hole as this, is rather an irregular sort of proceeding, I fancy. This shall be made known. I'll write to the papers." My uncle said this in a pretty loud voice, and in an open, unreserved sort of manner, with the view of engaging the two strangers in conversation if he could. But neither of them took any more notice of him than whispering to each other, and scowling at him as they did so. The lady was at the farther end of the room, and once she ventured to wave her hand, as if beseeching my uncle's assistance. At length the two strangers advanced a little, and the conversation began in earnest. "You don't know this is a private room, I suppose, fellow," said the gentleman in sky blue. "No, I do not, fellow," rejoined my uncle. "Only, if this is a private room specially ordered for the occasion, I should think the public room must be a very comfortable one." With this, my uncle sat himself down in a high-backed chair, and took such an accurate measure of the gentleman, with his eyes, that Tiggin and Welps could have supplied him with printed calico for a suit, and not an inch too much or too little from that estimate alone. "Quit this room," said both men together, grasping their swords. "Eh?" said my uncle, not at all appearing to comprehend their meaning. "Quit the room, or you are a dead man," said the ill-looking fellow with the large sword, drawing it at the same time and flourishing it in the air. "Down with him," cried the gentleman in sky blue, drawing his sword also, and falling back 2 or 3 yards. "Down with him," the lady gave a loud scream. Now, my uncle was always remarkable for great boldness and great presence of mind. All the time that he had appeared so indifferent to what was going on, he had been looking slyly about for some missile or weapon of defense, and at the very instant when the swords were drawn, he espied, standing in the chimney corner, an old basket-hilted rapier in a rusty scabbard. At one bound, my uncle caught it in his hand, drew it, flourished it gallantly above his head, called aloud to the lady to keep out of the way, hurled the chair at the man in sky blue, and the scabbard at the man in plum color, and taking advantage of the confusion, fell upon them both, pell-mell. Gentlemen, there is an old story none the worse for being true regarding a fine young Irish gentleman who, being asked if he could play the fiddle, replied he had no doubt he could, but he couldn't exactly say, for certain, because he had never tried. This is not inapplicable to my uncle, and his fencing. He had never had a sword in his hand before, except once when he played Richard III at a private theater, upon which occasion it was arranged with Richmond that he was to be run through, from behind, without showing fight at all. But here he was, cutting and slashing with two experienced swordsmen, thrusting and guarding and poking and slicing, and acquitting himself in the most manful and dexterous manner possible, although up to that time he had never been aware that he had the least notion of the science. It only shows how true the old saying is, that a man never knows what he can do till he tries, gentlemen. The noise of the combat was terrific, each of the three combatants swearing like troopers, and their swords clashing with as much noise as if all the knives and steels in Newport Market were rattling together, at the same time. When it was at its very height, the lady, to encourage my uncle most probably, withdrew her hood entirely from her face, and disclosed a countenance of such dazzling beauty that he would have fought against 50 men to win one smile from it and die. He had done wonders before, but now he began to powder away like a raving mad giant. At this very moment, the gentleman in sky blue turning round and seeing the young lady with her face uncovered, vented an exclamation of rage and jealousy, and, turning his weapon against her beautiful bosom, pointed a thrust at her heart, which caused my uncle to utter a cry of apprehension that made the building ring. The lady stepped lightly aside, and snatching the young man's sword from his hand, before he had recovered his balance, drove him to the wall and running it through him, and the paneling up to the very hilt, pinned him there, hard and fast. It was a splendid example. My uncle, with a loud shout of triumph, and a strength that was irresistible, made his adversary retreat in the same direction, and plunging the old rapier into the very center of a large red flower in the pattern of his waistcoat, nailed him beside his friend. There they both stood, gentlemen, jerking their arms and legs about in agony, like the toy-shop figures that are moved by a piece of packthread. My uncle always said, afterwards, that this was one of the surest means he knew of for disposing of an enemy, but it was liable to one objection on the ground of expense, inasmuch as it involved the loss of a sword for every man disabled. The mail, cried the lady, running up to my uncle and throwing her beautiful arms round his neck. We may yet escape. May, cried my uncle. Why, my dear, there's nobody else to kill, is there? My uncle was rather disappointed, gentlemen, for he thought a little quiet bit of love-making would be agreeable after the slaughtering, if it were only to change the subject. We have not an instant to lose here, said the young lady. He, pointing to the young gentleman in sky blue, is the only son of the powerful Marquis of Felidoville. Well then, my dear, I'm afraid he'll never come to the title, said my uncle, looking coolly at the young gentleman as he stood fixed up against the wall, in the cockchafer fashion that I have described. You have cut off the entail, my love. I have been torn from my home and my friends by these villains, said the young lady, her features glowing with indignation. That wretch would have married me by violence in another hour. Confound his impudence, said my uncle, bestowing a very contemptuous look on the dying heir of Felidoville. As you may guess from what you have seen, said the young lady, the party were prepared to murder me if I appealed to anyone for assistance. If their accomplices find us here, we are lost. 2 minutes hence may be too late. The male, with these words, overpowered by her feelings and the exertion of sticking the young Marquis of Felidoville, she sank into my uncle's arms. My uncle caught her up and bore her to the house door. There stood the male, with 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses ready harnessed, but no coachman, no guard, no hostler even at the horses' heads. Gentlemen, I hope I do no injustice to my uncle's memory when I express my opinion that although he was a bachelor, he had held some ladies in his arms before this time. I believe, indeed, that he had rather a habit of kissing barmaids, and I know that in 1 or 2 instances he had been seen by credible witnesses to hug a landlady in a very perceptible manner. I mention the circumstance to show what a very uncommon sort of person this beautiful young lady must have been to have affected my uncle in the way she did. He used to say that as her long dark hair trailed over his arm and her beautiful dark eyes fixed themselves upon his face when she recovered, he felt so strange and nervous that his legs trembled beneath him. But who can look in a sweet, soft pair of dark eyes without feeling queer? I can't, gentlemen. I am afraid to look at some eyes I know, and that's the truth of it. You will never leave me, murmured the young lady. Never, said my uncle. And he meant it too. My dear preserver, exclaimed the young lady. My dear, kind, brave preserver. Don't, said my uncle, interrupting her. Why? Inquired the young lady. Because your mouth looks so beautiful when you speak, rejoined my uncle, that I'm afraid I shall be rude enough to kiss it. The young lady put up her hand as if to caution my uncle not to do so, and said no, she didn't say anything, she smiled. When you are looking at a pair of the most delicious lips in the world, and see them gently break into a roguish smile if you are very near them, and nobody else by you cannot better testify your admiration of their beautiful form and color than by kissing them at once. My uncle did so, and I honor him for it. Hark, cried the young lady, starting. The noise of wheels and horses. So it is, said my uncle, listening. He had a good ear for wheels and the trampling of hoofs, but there appeared to be so many horses and carriages rattling towards them, from a distance, that it was impossible to form a guess at their number. The sound was like that of 50 brakes, with 6 blood cattle in each. We are pursued, cried the young lady, clasping her hands. We are pursued. I have no hope but in you. There was such an expression of terror in her beautiful face that my uncle made up his mind at once. He lifted her into the coach, told her not to be frightened, pressed his lips to hers once more, and then advising her to draw up the window to keep the cold air out, mounted to the box. Stay, love, cried the young lady. What's the matter? Said my uncle from the coach box. I want to speak to you, said the young lady, only a word. Only one word, dearest. Must I get down? Inquired my uncle. The lady made no answer, but she smiled again. Such a smile, gentlemen. It beat the other one, all to nothing. My uncle descended from his perch in a twinkling. What is it, my dear? Said my uncle, looking in at the coach window. The lady happened to bend forward at the same time, and my uncle thought she looked more beautiful than she had done yet. He was very close to her just then, gentlemen, so he really ought to know. What is it, my dear? Said my uncle. Will you never love anyone but me, never marry anyone beside? Said the young lady. My uncle swore a great oath that he never would marry anybody else, and the young lady drew in her head and pulled up the window. He jumped upon the box, squared his elbows, adjusted the ribbons, seized the whip which lay on the roof, gave one flick to the off-leader, and away went the 4 long-tailed, flowing-maned black horses at 15 good English miles an hour, with the old mail coach behind them. Phew! How they tore along! The noise behind grew louder. The faster the old mail went, the faster came the pursuers' men, horses, dogs, were leagued in the pursuit. The noise was frightful, but above all rose the voice of the young lady, urging my uncle on and shrieking, Faster! Faster! They whirled past the dark trees, as feathers would be swept before a hurricane. Houses, gates, churches, haystacks, objects of every kind they shot by, with a velocity and noise like roaring waters suddenly let loose. But still the noise of pursuit grew louder, and still my uncle could hear the young lady wildly screaming, Faster! Faster! My uncle plied whip and rein, and the horses flew onward till they were white with foam, and yet the noise behind increased, and yet the young lady cried, Faster! Faster! My uncle gave a loud stamp on the boot in the energy of the moment, and found that it was grey morning, and he was sitting in the wheelwright's yard, on the box of an old Edinburgh mail, shivering with the cold and wet and stamping his feet to warm them. He got down and looked eagerly inside for the beautiful young lady. Alas! There was neither door nor seat to the coach. It was a mere shell. Of course, my uncle knew very well that there was some mystery in the matter, and that everything had passed exactly as he used to relate it. He remained staunch to the great oath he had sworn to the beautiful young lady, refusing several eligible landladies on her account, and dying a bachelor at last. He always said what a curious thing it was that he should have found out, by such a mere accident as his clambering over the palings, that the ghosts of mail coaches and horses, guards, coachmen, and passengers were in the habit of making journeys regularly every night. He used to add that he believed he was the only living person who had ever been taken as a passenger on one of these excursions. And I think he was right. Gentlemen, at least I never heard of any other. I wonder what these ghosts of mail coaches carry in their bags, said the landlord, who had listened to the whole story with profound attention. The dead letters, of course, said the bagman. Oh, to be sure, rejoined the landlord. I never thought of that. Chapter 50. How Mr. Pickwick sped upon his mission, and how he was reinforced in the outset by a most unexpected auxiliary. The horses were put to, punctually at 9:15 next morning, and Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller having each taken his seat, the one inside and the other out, the postilion was duly directed to repair in the first instance to Mr. Bob Sawyer's house, for the purpose of taking up Mr. Benjamin Allen. It was with feelings of no small astonishment, when the carriage drew up before the door with the red lamp, and the very legible inscription of Sawyer late Nakamorph, that Mr. Pickwick saw, on popping his head out of the coach window, the boy in the gray livery very busily employed in putting up the shutters, the which, being an unusual and an unbusinesslike proceeding at that hour of the morning, at once suggested to his mind two inferences. The one, that some good friend and patient of Mr. Bob Sawyer, was dead. The other, that Mr. Bob Sawyer himself was bankrupt. "What is the matter?" said Mr. Pickwick to the boy. "Nothing's the matter, sir," replied the boy, expanding his mouth to the whole breadth of his countenance. All right," cried Bob Sawyer, suddenly appearing at the door with a small leather knapsack, limp and dirty, in one hand, and a rough coat and shawl thrown over the other arm. "I'm going, old fellow." "You?" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "Yes," replied Bob Sawyer, "and a regular expedition we'll make of it. Here, Sam. Look out." Thus briefly bespeaking Mr. Weller's attention, Mr. Bob Sawyer jerked the leather knapsack into the dickey, where it was immediately stowed away, under the seat, by Sam, who regarded the proceeding with great admiration. This done, Mr. Bob Sawyer, with the assistance of the boy, forcibly worked himself into the rough coat, which was a few sizes too small for him, and then advancing to the coach window, thrust in his head, and laughed boisterously. "What a start it is, isn't it?" cried Bob, wiping the tears out of his eyes with one of the cuffs of the rough coat. "My dear sir," said Mr. Pickwick, with some embarrassment, "I had no idea of your accompanying us." "No, that's just the very thing," replied Bob, seizing Mr. Pickwick by the lapel of his coat. "That's the joke." "Oh, that's the joke, is it?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Of course," replied Bob. "It's the whole point of the thing, you know that, and leaving the business to take care of itself, as it seems to have made up its mind not to take care of me." With this explanation of the phenomenon of the shutters, Mr. Bob Sawyer pointed to the shop, and relapsed into an ecstasy of mirth. "Bless me, you are surely not mad enough to think of leaving your patients without anybody to attend them," remonstrated Mr. Pickwick in a very serious tone. "Why not?" asked Bob in reply. "I shall save by it, you know. None of them ever pay. Besides," said Bob, lowering his voice to a confidential whisper, "they will be all the better for it. For, being nearly out of drugs and not able to increase my account just now, I should have been obliged to give them calomel all round, and it would have been certain to have disagreed with some of them. So it's all for the best." There was a philosophy and a strength of reasoning about this reply, which Mr. Pickwick was not prepared for. He paused a few moments, and added, less firmly than before, "But this chaise, my young friend, will only hold two, and I am pledged to Mr. Allen." "Don't think of me for a minute," replied Bob. "I've arranged it all. Sam and I will share the dickey between us. Look here. This little bill is to be wafered on the shop door. Sawyer, late Nakamorph. Inquire of Mrs. Cripps over the way, Mrs. Cripps is my boy's mother. Mr. Sawyer's very sorry, says Mrs. Cripps couldn't help it, fetched away early this morning to a consultation of the very first surgeons in the country, couldn't do, without him, would have him at any price, tremendous operation. The fact is, said Bob, in conclusion, it'll do me more good than otherwise, I expect. If it gets into one of the local papers, it will be the making of me. Here's Ben, now then, jump in." With these hurried words, Mr. Bob Sawyer pushed the postboy on one side, jerked his friend into the vehicle, slammed the door, put up the steps, wafered the bill on the street door, locked it, put the key in his pocket, jumped into the dicky, gave the word for starting, and did the whole with such extraordinary precipitation that before Mr. Pickwick had well begun to consider whether Mr. Bob Sawyer ought to go or not, they were rolling away. With Mr. Bob Sawyer thoroughly established as part and parcel of the equipage. So long as their progress was confined to the streets of Bristol, the facetious Bob kept his professional green spectacles on and conducted himself with becoming steadiness and gravity of demeanor, merely giving utterance to divers verbal witticisms for the exclusive behoof and entertainment of Mr. Samuel Weller. But when they emerged on the open road, he threw off his green spectacles and his gravity together, and performed a great variety of practical jokes, which were calculated to attract the attention of the passers-by, and to render the carriage and those it contained objects of more than ordinary curiosity. The least conspicuous among these feats being a most vociferous imitation of a key bugle, and the ostentatious display of a crimson silk pocket handkerchief attached to a walking stick, which was occasionally waved in the air with various gestures indicative of supremacy and defiance. "I wonder," said Mr. Pickwick, stopping in the midst of a most sedate conversation with Ben Allen, bearing reference to the numerous good qualities of Mr. Winkle and his sister, "I wonder what all the people we pass can see in us to make them stare so." "It's a neat turnout," replied Ben Allen, with something of pride in his tone. "They're not used to see this sort of thing every day, I dare say." "Possibly," replied Mr. Pickwick. "It may be so. Perhaps it is." Mr. Pickwick might very probably have reasoned himself into the belief that it really was, had he not, just then happening to look out of the coach window, observed that the looks of the passengers betokened anything but respectful astonishment, and that various telegraphic communications appeared to be passing between them and some persons outside the vehicle, whereupon it occurred to him that these demonstrations might be, in some remote degree, referable to the humorous deportment of Mr. Robert Sawyer. "I hope," said Mr. Pickwick, "that our volatile friend is committing no absurdities in that dicky behind." "Oh dear no," replied Ben Allen. "Except when he's elevated, Bob's the quietest creature breathing." Here a prolonged imitation of a key bugle broke upon the ear, succeeded by cheers and screams, all of which evidently proceeded from the throat and lungs of the quietest creature breathing, or in plainer designation of Mr. Bob Sawyer himself. Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Ben Allen looked expressively at each other, and the former gentleman taking off his hat and leaning out of the coach window until nearly the whole of his waistcoat was outside it, was at length enabled to catch a glimpse of his facetious friend. Mr. Bob Sawyer was seated, not in the dicky, but on the roof of the chaise, with his legs as far asunder as they would conveniently go, wearing Mr. Samuel Weller's hat on one side of his head, and bearing in one hand a most enormous sandwich, while in the other he supported a goodly-sized case bottle, to both of which he applied himself with intense relish, varying the monotony of the occupation by an occasional howl or the interchange of some lively badinage with any passing stranger. The crimson flag was carefully tied in an erect position to the rail of the dicky, and Mr. Samuel Weller, decorated with Bob Sawyer's hat, was seated in the center thereof, discussing a twin sandwich with an animated countenance, the expression of which betokened his entire and perfect approval of the whole arrangement. This was enough to irritate a gentleman with Mr. Pickwick's sense of propriety, but it was not the whole extent of the aggravation, for a stagecoach full, inside and out, was meeting them at the moment, and the astonishment of the passengers was very palpably evinced. The congratulations of an Irish family, too, who were keeping up with the chaise and begging all the time, were of rather a boisterous description, especially those of its male head, who appeared to consider the display as part and parcel of some political or other procession of triumph. "Mr. Sawyer," cried Mr. Pickwick in a state of great excitement, "Mr. Sawyer, sir." "Hallo," responded that gentleman, looking over the side of the chaise with all the coolness in life. "Are you mad, sir?" demanded Mr. Pickwick. "Not a bit of it," replied Bob, "only cheerful." "Cheerful, sir," ejaculated Mr. Pickwick. "Take down that scandalous red handkerchief, I beg." "I insist, sir." Sam, take it down." Before Sam could interpose, Mr. Bob Sawyer gracefully struck his colors, and having put them in his pocket, nodded in a courteous manner to Mr. Pickwick, wiped the mouth of the case bottle, and applied it to his own, thereby informing him, without any unnecessary waste of words, that he devoted that draught to wishing him all manner of happiness and prosperity. Having done this, Bob replaced the cork with great care, and looking benignantly down on Mr. Pickwick, took a large bite out of the sandwich and smiled. "Come," said Mr. Pickwick, whose momentary anger was not quite proof against Bob's immovable self-possession, "pray let us have no more of this absurdity." "No, no," replied Bob, once more exchanging hats with Mr. Weller. "I didn't mean to do it, only I got so enlivened with the ride that I couldn't help it." "Think of the look of the thing," expostulated Mr. Pickwick. "Have some regard to appearances." "Oh, certainly," said Bob, "it's not the sort of thing at all. All over, governor." Satisfied with this assurance, Mr. Pickwick once more drew his head into the chaise and pulled up the glass. But he had scarcely resumed the conversation which Mr. Bob Sawyer had interrupted, when he was somewhat startled by the apparition of a small dark body, of an oblong form, on the outside of the window, which gave sundry taps against it, as if impatient of admission. "What's this?" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "It looks like a case bottle," remarked Ben Allen, eyeing the object in question through his spectacles with some interest. "I rather think it belongs to Bob." The impression was perfectly accurate, for Mr. Bob Sawyer, having attached the case bottle to the end of the walking stick, was battering the window with it in token of his wish that his friends inside would partake of its contents in all good fellowship and harmony. "What's to be done?" said Mr. Pickwick, looking at the bottle. "This proceeding is more absurd than the other." "I think it would be best to take it in," replied Mr. Ben Allen. "It would serve him right to take it in and keep it, wouldn't it?" "It would," said Mr. Pickwick. "Shall I?" "I think it the most proper course we could possibly adopt," replied Ben. This advice quite coinciding with his own opinion, Mr. Pickwick gently let down the window and disengaged the bottle from the stick, upon which the latter was drawn up, and Mr. Bob Sawyer was heard to laugh heartily. "What a merry dog it is," said Mr. Pickwick, looking round at his companion with the bottle in his hand. "He is," said Mr. Allen. "You cannot possibly be angry with him," remarked Mr. Pickwick. "Quite out of the question," observed Benjamin Allen. During this short interchange of sentiments, Mr. Pickwick had, in an abstracted mood, uncorked the bottle. "What is it?" inquired Ben Allen carelessly. "I don't know," replied Mr. Pickwick with equal carelessness. "It smells, I think, like milk punch." "Oh, indeed," said Ben. "I think so," rejoined Mr. Pickwick, very properly guarding himself against the possibility of stating an untruth. "Mind, I could not undertake to say certainly, without tasting it." "You had better do so," said Ben. "We may as well know what it is." "Do you think so?" replied Mr. Pickwick. "Well, if you're curious to know, of course I have no objection." Ever willing to sacrifice his own feelings to the wishes of his friend, Mr. Pickwick at once took a pretty long taste. "What is it?" inquired Ben Allen, interrupting him with some impatience. "Curious," said Mr. Pickwick, smacking his lips. "I hardly know now." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Pickwick after a second taste. "It is punch." Mr. Ben Allen looked at Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pickwick looked at Mr. Ben Allen. Mr. Ben Allen smiled. Mr. Pickwick did not. "It would serve him right," said the last-named gentleman. "With some severity, it would serve him right to drink it every drop." "The very thing that occurred to me," said Ben Allen. "Is it indeed?" rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "Then here's his health." With these words, that excellent person took a most energetic pull at the bottle, and handed it to Ben Allen, who was not slow to imitate his example. The smiles became mutual, and the milk punch was gradually and cheerfully disposed of. "After all," said Mr. Pickwick, as he drained the last drop, "his pranks are really very amusing, very entertaining indeed." "You may say that," rejoined Mr. Ben Allen. In proof of Bob Sawyer's being one of the funniest fellows alive, he proceeded to entertain Mr. Pickwick with a long and circumstantial account how that gentleman once drank himself into a fever and got his head shaved. The relation of which pleasant and agreeable history was only stopped by the stoppage of the chaise at the Bell at Berkeley Heath, to change horses. "I say, we're going to dine here, aren't we?" said Bob, looking in at the window. "Dine," said Mr. Pickwick. "Why, we have only come 19 miles, and have 87.5 to go. Just the reason why we should take something to enable us to bear up against the fatigue," remonstrated Mr. Bob Sawyer. "Oh, it's quite impossible to dine at 11:30 o'clock in the day," replied Mr. Pickwick, looking at his watch. "So it is," rejoined Bob. "Lunch is the very thing." "Hollo you, sir. Lunch for 3, directly, and keep the horses back for a quarter of an hour. Tell them to put everything they have cold on the table and some bottled ale, and let us taste your very best Madeira." Issuing these orders with monstrous importance and bustle, Mr. Bob Sawyer at once hurried into the house to superintend the arrangements. In less than 5 minutes he returned and declared them to be excellent. The quality of the lunch fully justified the eulogium which Bob had pronounced, and very great justice was done to it, not only by that gentleman, but Mr. Ben Allen and Mr. Pickwick also. Under the auspices of the three, the bottled ale and the Madeira were promptly disposed of, and when the horses being once more put to, they resumed their seats, with the case bottle full of the best substitute for milk punch that could be procured on so short a notice. The key bugle sounded, and the red flag waved, without the slightest opposition on Mr. Pickwick's part. At the hop pole at Tewkesbury they stopped to dine, upon which occasion there was more bottled ale, with some more Madeira and some port besides, and here the case bottle was replenished for the 4th time. Under the influence of these combined stimulants, Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Ben Allen fell fast asleep for 30 miles, while Bob and Mr. Weller sang duets in the dickey. It was quite dark when Mr. Pickwick roused himself sufficiently to look out of the window. The straggling cottages by the roadside, the dingy hue of every object visible, the murky atmosphere, the paths of cinders and brick dust, the deep red glow of furnace fires in the distance, the volumes of dense smoke issuing heavily forth from high toppling chimneys, blackening and obscuring everything around. The glare of distant lights, the ponderous wagons which twirled along the road, laden with clashing rods of iron, or piled with heavy goods all, betokened their rapid approach to the great working town of Birmingham. As they rattled through the narrow thoroughfares leading to the heart of the turmoil, the sights and sounds of earnest occupation struck more forcibly on the senses. The streets were thronged with working people. The hum of labor resounded from every house. Lights gleamed from the long casement windows in the attic stories, and the whirl of wheels and noise of machinery shook the trembling walls. The fires, whose lurid, sullen light had been visible for miles, blazed fiercely up in the great works and factories of the town. The din of hammers, the rushing of steam, and the dead heavy clanking of engines was the harsh music which arose from every quarter. The postboy was driving briskly through the open streets, and past the handsome and well-lighted shops that intervene between the outskirts of the town and the Old Royal Hotel, before Mr. Pickwick had begun to consider the very difficult and delicate nature of the commission which had carried him thither. The delicate nature of this commission, and the difficulty of executing it in a satisfactory manner, were by no means lessened by the voluntary companionship of Mr. Bob Sawyer. Truth to tell, Mr. Pickwick felt that his presence on the occasion, however considerate and gratifying, was by no means an honor he would willingly have sought. In fact, he would cheerfully have given a reasonable sum of money to have had Mr. Bob Sawyer removed to any place at not less than 50 miles distance, without delay. Mr. Pickwick had never held any personal communication with Mr. Winkle, Sr., although he had once or twice corresponded with him by letter, and returned satisfactory answers to his inquiries concerning the moral character and behavior of his son. He felt nervously sensible that to wait upon him, for the first time, attended by Bob Sawyer and Ben Allen, both slightly fuddled, was not the most ingenious and likely means that could have been hit upon to prepossess him in his favor. "However," said Mr. Pickwick, endeavoring to reassure himself, "I must do the best I can. I must see him tonight, for I faithfully promised to do so. If they persist in accompanying me, I must make the interview as brief as possible, and be content that, for their own sakes, they will not expose themselves." As he comforted himself with these reflections, the chaise stopped at the door of the Old Royal. Ben Allen having been partially awakened from a stupendous sleep and dragged out by the collar by Mr. Samuel Weller, Mr. Pickwick was enabled to alight. They were shown to a comfortable apartment, and Mr. Pickwick at once propounded a question to the waiter concerning the whereabout of Mr. Winkle's residence. "Close by, sir," said the waiter, "not above 500 yards, sir." "Mr. Winkle is a wharfinger, sir, at the canal, sir." "Private residence is not, oh dear, no, sir, not 500 yards, sir." Here the waiter blew a candle out and made a feint of lighting it again, in order to afford Mr. Pickwick an opportunity of asking any further questions, if he felt so disposed. "Take anything now, sir," said the waiter, lighting the candle in desperation at Mr. Pickwick's silence. "Tea or coffee, sir?" "Dinner, sir." "Nothing now." "Very good, sir." "Like to order supper, sir?" "Not just now." "Very good, sir." Here he walked slowly to the door, and then stopping short, turned round and said, with great suavity, "Shall I send the chambermaid, gentlemen?" "You may if you please," replied Mr. Pickwick. "If you please, sir." "And bring some soda water," said Bob Sawyer. "Soda water, sir?" "Yes, sir." With his mind apparently relieved from an overwhelming weight, by having at last got an order for something, the waiter imperceptibly melted away. Waiters never walk or run. They have a peculiar and mysterious power of skimming out of rooms, which other mortals possess not. Some slight symptoms of vitality having been awakened in Mr. Ben Allen by the soda water, he suffered himself to be prevailed upon to wash his face and hands, and to submit to be brushed by Sam. Mr. Pickwick and Bob Sawyer having also repaired the disorder which the journey had made in their apparel, the three started forth, arm in arm, to Mr. Winkle's, Bob Sawyer impregnating the atmosphere with tobacco smoke as he walked along. About a quarter of a mile off, in a quiet, substantial-looking street, stood an old red brick house with 3 steps before the door and a brass plate upon it, bearing in fat Roman capitals the words, "Mr. Winkle." The steps were very white, and the bricks were very red, and the house was very clean, and here stood Mr. Pickwick, Mr. Benjamin Allen, and Mr. Bob Sawyer as the clock struck 10. A smart servant girl answered the knock, and started on beholding the 3 strangers. "Is Mr. Winkle at home, my dear?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "He is just going to supper, sir," replied the girl. "Give him that card if you please," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "Say I am sorry to trouble him at so late an hour, but I am anxious to see him tonight, and have only just arrived." The girl looked timidly at Mr. Bob Sawyer, who was expressing his admiration of her personal charms by a variety of wonderful grimaces, and casting an eye at the hats and greatcoats which hung in the passage, called another girl to mind the door while she went upstairs. The sentinel was speedily relieved, for the girl returned immediately, and begging pardon of the gentlemen for leaving them in the street, ushered them into a floor-clothed back parlor, half office and half dressing-room, in which the principal useful and ornamental articles of furniture were a desk, a wash-hand stand and shaving-glass, a boot-rack and boot-jack, a high stool, 4 chairs, a table, and an old 8-day clock. Over the mantelpiece were the sunken doors of an iron safe, while a couple of hanging shelves for books, an almanac, and several files of dusty papers decorated the walls. "Very sorry to leave you standing at the door, sir," said the girl, lighting a lamp and addressing Mr. Pickwick with a winning smile. "But you was quite strangers to me, and we have such a many trampers that only come to see what they can lay their hands on, that really." "There is not the least occasion for any apology, my dear," said Mr. Pickwick good-humoredly. "Not the slightest, my love," said Bob Sawyer, playfully stretching forth his arms and skipping from side to side as if to prevent the young lady's leaving the room. The young lady was not at all softened by these allurements, for she at once expressed her opinion that Mr. Bob Sawyer was an odous creature, and, on his becoming rather more pressing in his attentions, imprinted her fair fingers upon his face and bounced out of the room with many expressions of aversion and contempt. Deprived of the young lady's society, Mr. Bob Sawyer proceeded to divert himself by peeping into the desk, looking into all the table drawers, feigning to pick the lock of the iron safe, turning the almanac with its face to the wall, trying on the boots of Mr. Winkle, Sr., over his own, and making several other humorous experiments upon the furniture, all of which afforded Mr. Pickwick unspeakable horror and agony, and yielded Mr. Bob Sawyer proportionate delight. At length the door opened, and a little old gentleman in a snuff-colored suit, with a head and face the precise counterpart of those belonging to Mr. Winkle, Jr., excepting that he was rather bald, trotted into the room with Mr. Pickwick's card in one hand and a silver candlestick in the other. "Mr. Pickwick, sir, how do you do?" said Winkle the elder, putting down the candlestick and proffering his hand. "Hope I see you well, sir." "Glad to see you." "Be seated, Mr. Pickwick, I beg, sir." "This gentleman is—" "My friend, Mr. Sawyer," interposed Mr. Pickwick, "your son's friend." "Oh," said Mr. Winkle the elder, looking rather grimly at Bob. "I hope you are well, sir." "Right as a trivet, sir," replied Bob Sawyer. "This other gentleman," cried Mr. Pickwick, "is, as you will see when you have read the letter with which I am entrusted, a very near relative, or I should rather say a very particular friend of your son's. His name is Allen." "That gentleman?" inquired Mr. Winkle, pointing with the card towards Ben Allen, who had fallen asleep in an attitude which left nothing of him visible but his spine and his coat collar. Mr. Pickwick was on the point of replying to the question, and reciting Mr. Benjamin Allen's name and honorable distinctions at full length, when the sprightly Mr. Bob Sawyer, with a view of rousing his friend to a sense of his situation, inflicted a startling pinch upon the fleshly part of his arm, which caused him to jump up with a shriek. Suddenly aware that he was in the presence of a stranger, Mr. Ben Allen advanced and, shaking Mr. Winkle most affectionately by both hands for about 5 minutes, murmured, in some half-intelligible fragments of sentences, the great delight he felt in seeing him, and a hospitable inquiry whether he felt disposed to take anything after his walk, or would prefer waiting till dinner-time. Which done, he sat down and gazed about him with a petrified stare, as if he had not the remotest idea where he was, which indeed he had not. All this was most embarrassing to Mr. Pickwick, the more especially as Mr. Winkle, Sr., evinced palpable astonishment at the eccentric, not to say extraordinary, behavior of his two companions. To bring the matter to an issue at once, he drew a letter from his pocket, and presenting it to Mr. Winkle, Sr., said, "This letter, sir, is from your son. You will see, by its contents, that on your favorable and fatherly consideration of it depend his future happiness and welfare. Will you oblige me by giving it the calmest and coolest perusal, and by discussing the subject afterwards with me, in the tone and spirit in which alone it ought to be discussed? You may judge of the importance of your decision to your son, and his intense anxiety upon the subject, by my waiting upon you, without any previous warning, at so late an hour. And," added Mr. Pickwick, glancing slightly at his two companions, "and under such unfavorable circumstances." With this prelude, Mr. Pickwick placed 4 closely written sides of extra superfine wire-wove penitence in the hands of the astounded Mr. Winkle, Sr. Then, reseating himself in his chair, he watched his looks and manner. Anxiously, it is true, but with the open front of a gentleman who feels he has taken no part which he need excuse or palliate. The old wharfinger turned the letter over, looked at the front, back, and sides, made a microscopic examination of the fat little boy on the seal, raised his eyes to Mr. Pickwick's face, and then, seating himself on the high stool and drawing the lamp closer to him, broke the wax, unfolded the epistle, and lifting it to the light, prepared to read. Just at this moment, Mr. Bob Sawyer, whose wit had lain dormant for some minutes, placed his hands on his knees, and made a face after the portraits of the late Mr. Grimaldi, as clown. It so happened that Mr. Winkle, Sr., instead of being deeply engaged in reading the letter, as Mr. Bob Sawyer thought, chanced to be looking over the top of it at no less a person than Mr. Bob Sawyer himself. Rightly conjecturing that the face aforesaid was made in ridicule and derision of his own person, he fixed his eyes on Bob with such expressive sternness that the late Mr. Grimaldi's lineaments gradually resolved themselves into a very fine expression of humility and confusion. "Did you speak, sir?" inquired Mr. Winkle, Sr., after an awful silence. "No, sir," replied Bob, with no remains of the clown about him, save and except the extreme redness of his cheeks. "You are sure you did not, sir?" said Mr. Winkle, Sr. "Oh dear, yes, sir, quite," replied Bob. "I thought you did, sir," replied the old gentleman, with indignant emphasis. "Perhaps you looked at me, sir." "Oh no," "Sir, not at all," replied Bob with extreme civility. "I am very glad to hear it, sir," said Mr. Winkle, Sr. Having frowned upon the abashed Bob with great magnificence, the old gentleman again brought the letter to the light and began to read it seriously. Mr. Pickwick eyed him intently as he turned from the bottom line of the first page to the top line of the second, and from the bottom of the second to the top of the third, and from the bottom of the third to the top of the fourth. But not the slightest alteration of countenance afforded a clue to the feelings with which he received the announcement of his son's marriage, which Mr. Pickwick knew was in the very first half-dozen lines. He read the letter to the last word, folded it again with all the carefulness and precision of a man of business, and, just when Mr. Pickwick expected some great outbreak of feeling, dipped a pen in the inkstand, and said, as quietly as if he were speaking on the most ordinary counting-house topic, "What is Nathaniel's address, Mr. Pickwick?" "The George and Vulture at present," replied that gentleman. "George and Vulture. Where is that?" "George Yard, Lombard Street." "In the city?" "Yes." The old gentleman methodically endorsed the address on the back of the letter, and then, placing it in the desk, which he locked, said, as he got off the stool and put the bunch of keys in his pocket, "I suppose there is nothing else which need detain us, Mr. Pickwick." "Nothing else, my dear sir," observed that warm-hearted person in indignant amazement. "Nothing else. Have you no opinion to express on this momentous event in our young friend's life? No assurance to convey to him, through me, of the continuance of your affection and protection? Nothing to say which will cheer and sustain him, and the anxious girl who looks to him for comfort and support? My dear sir, consider." "I will consider," replied the old gentleman. "I have nothing to say just now. I am a man of business, Mr. Pickwick. I never commit myself hastily in any affair, and from what I see of this, I by no means like the appearance of it. £1,000 is not much, Mr. Pickwick." "You're very right, sir," interposed Ben Allen, just awake enough to know that he had spent his £1,000 without the smallest difficulty. "You're an intelligent man. Bob, he's a very knowing fellow, this. I am very happy to find that you do me the justice to make the admission, sir," said Mr. Winkle, Sr., looking contemptuously at Ben Allen, who was shaking his head profoundly. "The fact is, Mr. Pickwick, that when I gave my son a roving license for a year or so, to see something of men and manners, which he has done under your auspices, so that he might not enter life a mere boarding-school milksop to be gulled by everybody, I never bargained for this. He knows that very well, so if I withdraw my countenance from him on this account, he has no call to be surprised. He shall hear from me, Mr. Pickwick." "Good night, sir." Margaret opened the door. All this time, Bob Sawyer had been nudging Mr. Ben Allen to say something on the right side. Ben accordingly now burst, without the slightest preliminary notice, into a brief but impassioned piece of eloquence. "Sir," said Mr. Ben Allen, staring at the old gentleman, out of a pair of very dim and languid eyes, and working his right arm vehemently up and down, "you ought to be ashamed of yourself." "As the lady's brother, of course you are an excellent judge of the question," retorted Mr. Winkle, Sr. "There, that's enough. Pray say no more, Mr. Pickwick. Good night, gentlemen." With these words, the old gentleman took up the candlestick, and opening the room door, politely motioned towards the passage. "You will regret this, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, setting his teeth close together to keep down his collar, for he felt how important the effect might prove to his young friend. "I am at present of a different opinion," calmly replied Mr. Winkle, Sr. "Once again, gentlemen, I wish you a good night." Mr. Pickwick walked with angry strides into the street. Mr. Bob Sawyer, completely quelled by the decision of the old gentleman's manner, took the same course. Mr. Ben Allen's hat rolled down the steps immediately afterwards, and Mr. Ben Allen's body followed it directly. The whole party went silent and supperless to bed, and Mr. Pickwick thought, just before he fell asleep, that if he had known Mr. Winkle, Sr., had been quite so much of a man of business, it was extremely probable he might never have waited upon him on such an errand. Chapter 51, in which Mr. Pickwick encounters an old acquaintance too. Which fortunate circumstance, the reader is mainly indebted for matter of thrilling interest herein set down, concerning two great public men of might and power. The morning which broke upon Mr. Pickwick's sight at 8 o'clock was not at all calculated to elevate his spirits, or to lessen the depression which the unlooked-for result of his embassy inspired. The sky was dark and gloomy, the air was damp and raw, the streets were wet and sloppy. The smoke hung sluggishly above the chimney-tops, as if it lacked the courage to rise, and the rain came slowly and doggedly down, as if it had not even the spirit to pour. A gamecock in the stable-yard, deprived of every spark of his accustomed animation, balanced himself dismally on one leg in a corner. A donkey, moping with drooping head under the narrow roof of an outhouse, appeared from his meditative and miserable countenance to be contemplating suicide. In the street, umbrellas were the only things to be seen, and the clicking of pattens and splashing of raindrops were the only sounds to be heard. The breakfast was interrupted by very little conversation. Even Mr. Bob Sawyer felt the influence of the weather and the previous day's excitement. In his own expressive language he was floored, so was Mr. Ben Allen. So was Mr. Pickwick. In protracted expectation of the weather clearing up, the last evening paper from London was read and reread with an intensity of interest only known in cases of extreme destitution. Every inch of the carpet was walked over with similar perseverance. The windows were looked out of, often enough to justify the imposition of an additional duty upon them. All kinds of topics of conversation were started, and failed. And at length Mr. Pickwick, when noon had arrived, without a change for the better, rang the bell resolutely and ordered out the chaise. Although the roads were miry, and the drizzling rain came down harder than it had done yet, and although the mud and wet splashed in at the open windows of the carriage to such an extent that the discomfort was almost as great to the pair of insides as to the pair of outsides, still there was something in the motion, and the sense of being up and doing, which was so infinitely superior to being pent in a dull room, looking at the dull rain dripping into a dull street, that they all agreed on starting. That the change was a great improvement, and wondered how they could possibly have delayed making it as long as they had done. When they stopped to change at Coventry, the steam ascended from the horses in such clouds as wholly to obscure the hostler, whose voice was however heard to declare from the mist that he expected the first gold medal from the Humane Society on their next distribution of rewards for taking the postboy's hat off. The water descending from the brim of which, the invisible gentleman declared, must have drowned him, the postboy, but for his great presence of mind in tearing it promptly from his head and drying the gasping man's countenance with a wisp of straw. "This is pleasant," said Bob Sawyer, turning up his coat collar and pulling the shawl over his mouth to concentrate the fumes of a glass of brandy just swallowed. "Worry," replied Sam composedly. "You don't seem to mind it," observed Bob. "Vy, I don't exactly see no good my mindin' on it 'ud do, sir," replied Sam. "That's an unanswerable reason, anyhow," said Bob. "Yes, sir," rejoined Mr. Weller. "Wotver is right, as the young nobleman sweetly remarked when they put him down in the pension list, 'cause his mother's uncle's wife's grandfather vunce lit the king's pipe vith a portable tinderbox." "Not a bad notion that, Sam," said Mr. Bob Sawyer approvingly. "Just what the young nobleman said every quarter-day arterwards for the rest of his life," replied Mr. Weller. "Wo's you ever called in?" inquired Sam, glancing at the driver after a short silence, and lowering his voice to a mysterious whisper. "Wo's you ever called in, when you was 'prentice to a sawbones to whisset a postboy?" "I don't remember that I ever was," replied Bob Sawyer. "You never see a post in that air hospital as you walked, as they says o' the ghosts, did you?" demanded Sam. "No," replied Bob Sawyer. "I don't think I ever did." "Never knowed a churchyard where there was a postboy's tombstone, or see a dead postboy, did you?" inquired Sam, pursuing his catechism. "No," rejoined Bob, "I never did." "No," rejoined Sam triumphantly. "Nor never will, and there's another thing that no man never see, and that's a dead donkey. No man never see a dead donkey, 'cept the gentleman in the black silk smalls as knowed the young 'ooman as kep a goat, and that was a French donkey, so worry likely he warn't one o' the reglar breed." "Well, what has that got to do with the postboys?" asked Bob Sawyer. "This here," replied Sam. Without goin' so far as to assert, as some worry-sensible people do, that postboys and donkeys is both immortal, what I say is this: that whenever they feels theirselves gettin' stiff and past their work, they just rides off together, one postboy to a pair in the usual way. What becomes on 'em nobody knows, but it's worry probable as they starts ave to take their pleasure in some other world, for there ain't a man alive as ever see either a donkey or a postboy tackin' his pleasure in this. Expatiating upon this learned and remarkable theory, and citing many curious statistical and other facts in its support, Sam Weller beguiled the time until they reached Dunchurch, where a dry postboy and fresh horses were procured. The next stage was Daventry, and the next Towcester. And at the end of each stage, it rained harder than it had done at the beginning. "I say," remonstrated Bob Sawyer, looking in at the coach window as they pulled up before the door of the Saracen's Head, Towcester, "this won't do, you know." "Bless me," said Mr. Pickwick, just awakening from a nap, "I'm afraid you're wet." "Oh, you are you?" returned Bob. "Yes, I am, a little that way, uncomfortably damp perhaps." Bob did look dampish, inasmuch as the rain was streaming from his neck, elbows, cuffs, skirts, and knees, and his whole apparel shone so with the wet that it might have been mistaken for a full suit of prepared oilskin. "I am rather wet," said Bob, giving himself a shake and casting a little hydraulic shower around, like a Newfoundland dog just emerged from the water. "I think it's quite impossible to go on tonight," interposed Ben. "Out of the question, sir," remarked Sam Weller, coming to assist in the conference. "It's a cruelty to animals, sir, to ask 'em to do it." "There's beds here, sir," said Sam, addressing his master, "everything clean and comfortable. Worry good little dinner, sir. They can get ready in half an hour pair of fowls, sir, and a weal cutlet, French beans, tatters, tart, and tidiness. You'd better stop where you are, sir, if I might recommend. Take it with sir, as the doctor said." The host of the Saracen's Head opportunely appeared at this moment, to confirm Mr. Weller's statement relative to the accommodations of the establishment, and to back his entreaties with a variety of dismal conjectures regarding the state of the roads, the doubt of fresh horses being to be had at the next stage, the dead certainty of its raining all night, the equally mortal certainty of its clearing up in the morning, and other topics of inducement familiar to innkeepers. "Well," said Mr. Pickwick, "but I must send a letter to London by some conveyance, so that it may be delivered the very first thing in the morning, or I must go forwards at all hazards." The landlord smiled his delight. Nothing could be easier than for the gentleman to enclose a letter in a sheet of brown paper, and send it on either by the mail or the night coach from Birmingham. If the gentleman were particularly anxious to have it left as soon as possible, he might write outside, "To be delivered immediately," which was sure to be attended to, or pay the bearer half-a-crown extra for instant delivery, which was surer still. "Very well," said Mr. Pickwick, "then we will stop here." "Lights in the sun, John, make up the fire, the gentlemen are wet," cried the landlord. "This way, gentlemen, don't trouble yourselves about the postboy now, sir. I'll send him to you when you ring for him, sir. Now, John, the candles." The candles were brought, the fire was stirred up, and a fresh log of wood thrown on. In 10 minutes' time, a waiter was laying the cloth for dinner, the curtains were drawn, the fire was blazing brightly, and everything looked, as everything always does in all decent English inns, as if the travelers had been expected and their comforts prepared for days beforehand. Mr. Pickwick sat down at a side table and hastily indited a note to Mr. Winkle, merely informing him that he was detained by stress of weather, but would certainly be in London next day, until when he deferred any account of his proceedings. This note was hastily made into a parcel, and dispatched to the bar per Mr. Samuel Weller. Sam left it with the landlady, and was returning to pull his master's boots off, after drying himself by the kitchen fire, when glancing casually through a half-opened door, he was arrested by the sight of a gentleman with a sandy head who had a large bundle of newspapers lying on the table before him, and was perusing the leading article of one with a settled sneer which curled up his nose and all other features into a majestic expression of haughty contempt. "Hollo," said Sam, "I ought to know that airhead and them features, the eyeglass too, and the broad-brim tile. Eatansville to vit, or I'm a Roman." Sam was taken with a troublesome cough at once, for the purpose of attracting the gentleman's attention. The gentleman, starting at the sound, raised his head and his eyeglass, and disclosed to view the profound and thoughtful features of Mr. Pott of the Eatanswill Gazette. "Beggin' your pardon, sir," said Sam, advancing with a bow. "My master, here, Mr. Pott." "Hush! Hush!" cried Pott, drawing Sam into the room and closing the door with a countenance of mysterious dread and apprehension. "What's the matter, sir?" inquired Sam, looking vacantly about him. "Not a whisper of my name," replied Pott. "This is a buff neighborhood. If the excited and irritable populace knew I was here, I should be torn to pieces." "No." "Vould you, sir?" inquired Sam. "I should be the victim of their fury," replied Pott. "Now, young man, what of your master?" "He's a-stopping here tonight on his way to town with a couple of friends," replied Sam. "Is Mr. Winkle one of them?" inquired Pott with a slight frown. "No, sir." "Mr. Winkle stops at home now," rejoined Sam. "He's married." "Married?" exclaimed Pott with frightful vehemence. He stopped, smiled darkly, and added in a low, vindictive tone, "It serves him right." Having given vent to this cruel ebullition of deadly malice and cold-blooded triumph over a fallen enemy, Mr. Pott inquired whether Mr. Pickwick's friends were blue. Receiving a most satisfactory answer in the affirmative from Sam, who knew as much about the matter as Pott himself, he consented to accompany him to Mr. Pickwick's room, where a hearty welcome awaited him, and an agreement to club their dinners together was at once made and ratified. "And how are matters going on in Eatanswill?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, when Pott had taken a seat near the fire and the whole party had got their wet boots off and dry slippers on. "Is the Independent still in being?" "The Independent, sir," replied Pott, "is still dragging on a wretched and lingering career. Abhorred and despised by even the few who are cognizant of its miserable and disgraceful existence, stifled by the very filth it so profusely scatters, rendered deaf and blind by the exhalations of its own slime. The obscene journal, happily unconscious of its degraded state, is rapidly sinking beneath that treacherous mud which, while it seems to give it a firm standing with the low and debased classes of society, is nevertheless rising above its detested head, and will speedily engulf it forever." Having delivered this manifesto, which formed a portion of his last week's leader, with vehement articulation, the editor paused to take breath and looked majestically at Bob Sawyer. "You are a young man, sir," said Pott. Mr. Bob Sawyer nodded. "So are you, sir," said Pott, addressing Mr. Ben Allen. Ben admitted the soft impeachment. "And are both deeply imbued with those blue principles, which, so long as I live, I have pledged myself to the people of these kingdoms to support and to maintain," suggested Pott. "Why, I don't exactly know about that," replied Bob Sawyer. "I am—" "Not buff, Mr. Pickwick," interrupted Pott, drawing back his chair. "Your friend is not buff, sir." "No, no," rejoined Bob. "I'm a kind of plaid at present, a compound of all sorts of colors." "A waverer," said Pott solemnly, "a waverer. I should like to show you a series of 8 articles, sir, that have appeared in the Eatanswill Gazette. I think I may venture to say that you would not be long in establishing your opinions on a firm and solid blue basis, sir." "I dare say I should turn very blue long before I got to the end of them," responded Bob. Mr. Pott looked dubiously at Bob Sawyer for some seconds, and turning to Mr. Pickwick said, "You have seen the literary articles which have appeared at intervals in the Eatanswill Gazette in the course of the last 3 months, and which have excited such general, I may say such universal attention and admiration." "Why," replied Mr. Pickwick, slightly embarrassed by the question, "the fact is, I have been so much engaged in other ways that I really have not had an opportunity of perusing them." "You should do so, sir," said Pott with a severe countenance. "I will," said Mr. Pickwick. "They appeared in the form of a copious review of a work on Chinese metaphysics, sir," said Pott. "Oh," observed Mr. Pickwick, "from your pen, I hope." "From the pen of my critic, sir," rejoined Pott with dignity. "An abstruse subject, I should conceive," said Mr. Pickwick. "Very, sir," responded Pott, looking intensely sage. He crammed for it, to use a technical but expressive term. He read up for the subject, at my desire, in the Encyclopedia Britannica. "Indeed," said Mr. Pickwick, I was not aware that that valuable work contained any information respecting Chinese metaphysics." "He read, sir," rejoined Pott, laying his hand on Mr. Pickwick's knee, and looking round with a smile of intellectual superiority. "He read for metaphysics under the letter 1000, and for China under the letter 100, and combined his information, sir." Mr. Pott's features assumed so much additional grandeur at the recollection of the power and research displayed in the learned effusions in question, that some minutes elapsed before Mr. Pickwick felt emboldened to renew the conversation. At length, as the editor's countenance gradually relaxed into its customary expression of moral supremacy, he ventured to resume the discourse by asking, "Is it fair to inquire what great object has brought you so far from home?" "That object which actuates and animates me in all my gigantic labors, sir," replied Pott, with a calm smile. "My country's good." "I supposed it was some public mission," observed Mr. Pickwick. "Yes, sir," resumed Pott, "it is." Here, bending towards Mr. Pickwick, he whispered in a deep, hollow voice, "A buff ball, sir, will take place in Birmingham tomorrow evening." "God bless me," exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "Yes, sir, and supper," added Pott. "You don't say so," ejaculated Mr. Pickwick. Pott nodded portentously. Now, although Mr. Pickwick feigned to stand aghast at this disclosure, he was so little versed in local politics that he was unable to form an adequate comprehension of the importance of the dire conspiracy it referred to. Observing which, Mr. Pott, drawing forth the last number of the Eatanswill Gazette, and referring to the same, delivered himself of the following paragraph. "Hole and corner, bufffery. A reptile contemporary has recently sweltered forth his black venom in the vain and hopeless attempt of sullying the fair name of our distinguished and excellent representative, the Honorable Mr. Slumkey, that Slumkey whom we, long before he gained his present noble and exalted position, predicted would one day be, as he now is, at once his country's brightest honor and her proudest boast. Alike her bold defender and her honest pride-our reptile contemporary, we say, has made himself merry, at the expense of a superbly embossed plated coal scuttle, which has been presented to that glorious man by his enraptured constituents, and towards the purchase of which, the nameless wretch insinuates, the Honorable Mr. Slumkey himself contributed, through a confidential friend of his butler, more than 3/4 of the whole sum subscribed. Why does not the crawling creature see that even if this be the fact, the Honorable Mr. Slumkey only appears in a still more amiable and radiant light than before, if that be possible? Does not even his obtuseness perceive that this amiable and touching desire to carry out the wishes of the constituent body must forever endear him to the hearts and souls of such of his fellow townsmen as are not worse than swine, or, in other words, who are not as debased as our contemporary himself? But such is the wretched trickery of hole and corner buffery. These are not its only artifices. Treason is abroad. We boldly state, now that we are goaded to the disclosure, and we throw ourselves on the country and its constables for protection, we boldly state that secret preparations are at this moment in progress for a buff ball, which is to be held in a buff town, in the very heart and center of a buff population, which is to be conducted by a buff master of the ceremonies, which is to be attended by 4 ultra-buff members of Parliament, and the admission to which is to be by buff tickets. Does our fiendish contemporary wince? Let him writhe in impotent malice. As we pen the words, we will be there. "There, sir," said Pott, folding up the paper quite exhausted, "that is the state of the case." The landlord and waiter entering at the moment with dinner caused Mr. Pott to lay his finger on his lips, in token that he considered his life in Mr. Pickwick's hands and depended on his secrecy. Messrs. Bob Sawyer and Benjamin Allen, who had irreverently fallen asleep during the reading of the quotation from the Eatanswill Gazette, and the discussion which followed it, were roused by the mere whispering of the talismanic word dinner in their ears. And to dinner they went with good digestion waiting on appetite, and health on both, and a waiter on all 3. In the course of the dinner, and the sitting which succeeded it, Mr. Pott descending, for a few moments, to domestic topics, informed Mr. Pickwick that the heir of Eatanswill not agreeing with his lady, she was then engaged in making a tour of different fashionable watering places with a view to the recovery of her wonted health and spirits. This was a delicate veiling of the fact that Mrs. Pot, acting upon her often repeated threat of separation, had, in virtue of an arrangement negotiated by her brother, the lieutenant, and concluded by Mr. Pot, permanently retired with the faithful bodyguard upon one moiety or half part of the annual income and profits arising from the editorship and sale of the Eatanswill Gazette. While the great Mr. Pot was dwelling upon this and other matters, enlivening the conversation from time to time with various extracts from his own lucubrations, a stern stranger, calling from the window of a stagecoach, outward bound, which halted at the inn to deliver packages, requested to know whether if he stopped short on his journey and remained there for the night, he could be furnished with the necessary accommodation of a bed and bedstead. "Certainly, sir," replied the landlord. "I can I?" inquired the stranger, who seemed habitually suspicious in look and manner. "No doubt of it, sir," replied the landlord. "Good," said the stranger. "Coachman, I get down here. Guard my carpet bag." Bidding the other passengers good night, in a rather snappish manner, the stranger alighted. He was a shortish gentleman, with very stiff black hair cut in the porcupine or blacking-brush style, and standing stiff and straight all over his head. His aspect was pompous and threatening. His manner was peremptory. His eyes were sharp and restless, and his whole bearing bespoke a feeling of great confidence in himself and a consciousness of immeasurable superiority over all other people. This gentleman was shown into the room originally assigned to the patriotic Mr. Pot, and the waiter remarked, in dumb astonishment at the singular coincidence, that he had no sooner lighted the candles than the gentleman, diving into his hat, drew forth a newspaper, and began to read it with the very same expression of indignant scorn, which, upon the majestic features of Pot, had paralyzed his energies an hour before. The man observed, too, that, whereas Mr. Pot's scorn had been roused by a newspaper headed the Eatanswill Independent, this gentleman's withering contempt was awakened by a newspaper entitled the Eatanswill Gazette. "Send the landlord," said the stranger. "Yes, sir," rejoined the waiter. The landlord was sent and came. "Are you the landlord?" inquired the gentleman. "I am, sir," replied the landlord. "Do you know me?" demanded the gentleman. "I have not had that pleasure, sir," rejoined the landlord. "My name is Slurk," said the gentleman. The landlord slightly inclined his head. "Slurk, sir," repeated the gentleman haughtily. "Do you know me now, man?" The landlord scratched his head, looked at the ceiling and at the stranger, and smiled feebly. "Do you know me, man?" inquired the stranger angrily. The landlord made a strong effort, and at length replied, "Well, sir, I do not know you." "Great heaven," said the stranger, dashing his clenched fist upon the table. "And this is popularity." The landlord took a step or two towards the door. The stranger, fixing his eyes upon him, resumed. "This," said the stranger, "this is gratitude for years of labor and study in behalf of the masses. I alight wet and weary. No enthusiastic crowds press forward to greet their champion. The church bells are silent. The very name elicits no responsive feeling in their torpid bosoms. It is enough," said the agitated Mr. Slurk, pacing to and fro, "to curdle the ink in one's pen and induce one to abandon their cause forever." "Did you say brandy and water, sir?" said the landlord, venturing a hint. "Rum," said Mr. Slurk, turning fiercely upon him. "Have you got a fire anywhere?" "We can light one directly, sir," said the landlord. "Which will throw out no heat until it is bedtime," interrupted Mr. Slurk. "Is there anybody in the kitchen?" "Not a soul." There was a beautiful fire. Everybody had gone, and the house door was closed for the night. "I will drink my rum and water," said Mr. Slurk, "by the kitchen fire." So, gathering up his hat and newspaper, he stalked solemnly behind the landlord to that humble apartment, and throwing himself on a settle by the fireside, resumed his countenance of scorn and began to read and drink in silent dignity. Now some demon of discord, flying over the Saracen's head at that moment, on casting down his eyes in mere idle curiosity, happened to behold Slurk established comfortably by the kitchen fire, and Pot slightly elevated with wine in another room, upon which the malicious demon, darting down into the last-mentioned apartment with inconceivable rapidity, passed at once into the head of Mr. Bob Sawyer, and prompted him for his, the demon's, own evil purpose to speak as follows. "I say, we've let the fire out." It's uncommonly cold after the rain, isn't it? It really is, replied Mr. Pickwick, shivering. It wouldn't be a bad notion to have a cigar by the kitchen fire, would it? Said Bob Sawyer, still prompted by the demon aforesaid. It would be particularly comfortable, I think, replied Mr. Pickwick. Mr. Pott, what do you say? Mr. Pott yielded a ready assent, and all four travelers, each with his glass in his hand, at once betook themselves to the kitchen, with Sam Weller heading the procession to show them the way. The stranger was still reading. He looked up and started. Mr. Pott started. What's the matter? Whispered Mr. Pickwick. That reptile, replied Pott. What reptile? Said Mr. Pickwick, looking about him for fear he should tread on some overgrown black beetle or dropsical spider. That reptile, whispered Pott, catching Mr. Pickwick by the arm and pointing towards the stranger. That reptile Slurk of the Independent. Perhaps we had better retire, whispered Mr. Pickwick. Never, sir, rejoined Pott valiant in a double sense never. With these words, Mr. Pott took up his position on an opposite settle, and selecting one from a little bundle of newspapers, began to read against his enemy. Mr. Pott, of course, read the Independent, and Mr. Slurk, of course, read the Gazette, and each gentleman audibly expressed his contempt at the other's compositions by bitter laughs and sarcastic sniffs, whence they proceeded to more open expressions of opinion, such as absurd, wretched, atrocity, humbug, knavery, dirt, filth, slime, ditchwater, and other critical remarks of the like nature. Both Mr. Bob Sawyer and Mr. Ben Allen had beheld these symptoms of rivalry and hatred, with a degree of delight which imparted great additional relish to the cigars at which they were puffing most vigorously. The moment they began to flag, the mischievous Mr. Bob Sawyer, addressing Slurk with great politeness, said, "Will you allow me to look at your paper, sir, when you have quite done with it? You will find very little to repay you for your trouble in this contemptible thing, sir," replied Slurk, bestowing a satanic frown on Pott. "You shall have this presently," said Pott, looking up, pale with rage, and quivering in his speech from the same cause. "Huh. You will be amused with this fellow's audacity." Terrible emphasis was laid upon thing and fellow, and the faces of both editors began to glow with defiance. "The ribaldry of this miserable man is despicably disgusting," said Pott, pretending to address Bob Sawyer and scowling upon Slurk. Here Mr. Slurk laughed very heartily, and folding up the paper so as to get at a fresh column conveniently, said that the blockhead really amused him. "What an impudent blunderer this fellow is," said Pott, turning from pink to crimson. "Did you ever read any of this man's foolery, sir?" inquired Slurk of Bob Sawyer. "Never," replied Bob. "Is it very bad?" "Oh, shocking." "Shocking," rejoined Slurk. "Really? Dear me, this is too atrocious," exclaimed Pott at this juncture, still feigning to be absorbed in his reading. "If you can wade through a few sentences of malice, meanness, falsehood, perjury, treachery, and cant," said Slurk, handing the paper to Bob, "you will, perhaps, be somewhat repaid by a laugh at the style of this ungrammatical twaddler." "What's that you said, sir?" inquired Mr. Pott, looking up, trembling all over with passion. "What's that to you, sir?" replied Slurk. "Ungrammatical twaddler, was it, sir?" said Pott. "Yes, sir, it was," replied Slurk, "and blue boar, sir, if you like that better, ha." "Ha." Mr. Pott retorted not a word at this jocose insult, but deliberately folded up his copy of the Independent, flattened it carefully down, crushed it beneath his boot, spat upon it with great ceremony, and flung it into the fire. "There, sir," said Pott, retreating from the stove, "and that's the way I would serve the viper who produces it, if I were not, fortunately for him, restrained by the laws of my country." "Serve him so, sir," cried Slurk, starting up. "Those laws shall never be appealed to by him, sir, in such a case." "Serve him so, sir." "Here." "Here," said Bob Sawyer. "Nothing can be fairer," observed Mr. Ben Allen. "Serve him so, sir," reiterated Slurk in a loud voice. Mr. Pott darted a look of contempt, which might have withered an anchor. "Serve him so, sir," reiterated Slurk in a louder voice than before. "I will not, sir," rejoined Pott. "Oh, you won't you, sir?" said Mr. Slurk in a taunting manner. "You hear this, gentlemen?" "He won't, not that he's afraid, oh no." "He won't, Huh? Huh? I consider you, sir, said Mr. Pot, moved by this sarcasm, I consider you a viper. I look upon you, sir, as a man who has placed himself beyond the pale of society by his most audacious, disgraceful, and abominable public conduct. I view you, sir, personally and politically, in no other light than as a most unparalleled and unmitigated viper. The indignant Independent did not wait to hear the end of this personal denunciation, for, catching up his carpet-bag, which was well stuffed with movables, he swung it in the air as Pot turned away, and, letting it fall with a circular sweep on his head, just at that particular angle of the bag where a good thick hairbrush happened to be packed, caused a sharp crash to be heard throughout the kitchen, and brought him at once to the ground. "Gentlemen," cried Mr. Pickwick, as Pot started up and seized the fire-shovel gentleman. "Consider, for heaven's sake help Sam here, pray. Gentlemen, interfere, somebody." Uttering these incoherent exclamations, Mr. Pickwick rushed between the infuriated combatants just in time to receive the carpet-bag on one side of his body and the fire-shovel on the other. Whether the representatives of the public feeling of Eatanswill were blinded by animosity, or, being both acute reasoners, saw the advantage of having a third party between them to bear all the blows, certain it is that they paid not the slightest attention to Mr. Pickwick, but defying each other with great spirit, plied the carpet-bag and the fire-shovel most fearlessly. Mr. Pickwick would unquestionably have suffered severely for his humane interference, if Mr. Weller, attracted by his master's cries, had not rushed in at the moment, and, snatching up a meal sack, effectually stopped the conflict by drawing it over the head and shoulders of the mighty Pot, and clasping him tight round the shoulders. "Take away that air bag from the t'other madman," said Sam to Ben Allen and Bob Sawyer, who had done nothing but dodge round the group, each with a tortoise-shell lancet in his hand, ready to bleed the first man stunned. "Give it up, you wretched little creature, or I'll smother you in it." Awed by these threats and quite out of breath, the Independent suffered himself to be disarmed, and Mr. Weller, removing the extinguisher from Pot, set him free with a caution. "You take yourselves off to bed quietly," said Sam, "or I'll put you both in it, and let you fight it out with the mouth tied, as I would a dozen sich, if they played these games. And you have the goodness to come this here way, sir, if you please." Thus addressing his master, Sam took him by the arm and led him off, while the rival editors were severally removed to their beds by the landlord, under the inspection of Mr. Bob Sawyer and Mr. Benjamin Allen, breathing, as they went away, many sanguinary threats, and making vague appointments for mortal combat next day. When they came to think it over, however, it occurred to them that they could do it much better in print, so they recommenced deadly hostilities without delay, and all Eatanswill rung with their boldness on paper. They had taken themselves off in separate coaches early next morning, before the other travelers were stirring, and the weather having now cleared up, the chaise companions once more turned their faces to London.